This is a birthday letter that Brian crafted and sent to his grandfather. He wrote this July 3rd, 1992. He was in his early 20s. And he explains why it is that he didn't purchase a Hallmark card. This is what he wrote. Dear Grandpa, I looked everywhere for the perfect card for your birthday. Well, I did see some pretty nice ones. I didn't find any that say some of the things I wanted to tell you on your 80th. I didn't find a single card to thank a grandfather for staking out the walk home from grade school and ambushing his grandson's bullies. I couldn't find one to thank a grandfather for helping build a really fast Pinewood Derby car. I didn't find a single card to thank a grandfather for giving the one all-important sailing lesson. I also couldn't find one that thanked you for coming to a score of concerts, plays, musicals, and marching band competitions. I also know I'd never find a card to thank you for all the little things that will stay with me forever. Pool games, ping pong, balls floating in the shop vac, the glimmer in your eyes when the Purple Martins came back, advice on how to stand up to high school bullies, buckets of corn to feed the geese, your laughter as you figured out another way to outsmart the squirrels. I hoped I could find a card that said, quote, I would love nothing more than to live my life the way you have, unquote. But I didn't find that one either. In the end, I decided that Hallmark doesn't make cards like the one I was looking for because few people have grandfathers like you. I guess Hallmark also doesn't make cards like that because it's so difficult to even put words to the way I feel. My life is richer and fuller because of you, and I love you very dearly. Happy birthday, Brian. The reason we're here is because our lives are richer and fuller because of Brian. Because he lived a life just like his grandpa. And he touched our lives with his love. And it's my privilege today to share a little of the story and why we celebrate what was and what is. The extraordinary story, of course, starts in Ames, Iowa. His dad was in the doctoral program at Iowa. His mother, Carol, she actually helped maintain the household by typing dissertations for $1 a page. Unless it was a doctorate in any of the hard sciences or mathematics, and then there were formulas and the price jumped to $1.50 a page. Brian was actually born December 5th, 1968. He was due November 7th, and it may have been the only time he was late, actually. His mother was astounded, wondering if the doctor got it wrong or if Brian was just having so much fun. He tarried on the way. He was a precocious child almost from the very beginning. He slept beautifully, and he slept early. And it was remarkable because Gene and Carol lived in what was the equivalent of a Quonset hut right next to the railroad tracks. And the freight trains rumbled by constantly. They looked at me and they said, we'd like to tell you that he walked at 9 months, but that wouldn't be true. You see, he never actually walked. He started running at 9 months and never stopped. And by the time he was a year old, he was already getting stitches on his forehead. And even as an adult, if you look very, very closely, you could see the unique crosshatch pattern on his forehead that were the stitches. Do you remember? It was kind of like most of a tic-tac-toe grid with one of the vertical lines missing. He was so exuberant about life. From Ames, Iowa, they moved to Chicago area so his dad could finish original research in nuclear physics. His dad was the quintessential rocket scientist. And after being there and being introduced to Sesame Street, you see, Brian was a child just as Sesame Street was in its very genesis. He was kind of the prototypical Sesame Street child. And it was so cool because he loved to watch television. He loved interesting television. There was something like the Electric Company. And Gene and Carol both remembered that it got him all revved up because it was all flashing lights. But then Mr. Rogers would come on and he would calm Brian down. It's funny because from Chicago area they moved to Maryland, where Gene did postdoc work at University of Maryland. Brian was to start school and they held him back a year because his birthday was in December. And so when he went to kindergarten, he was reading at a 3rd grade level, and they almost immediately promoted him into the next grade. Isn't that funny? When he was 3 years old, he was already reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. He was a precocious child. He had amazing gifts, which meant that at times he didn't precisely fit in. His parents moved here back to Lee Summit. And after they had moved here, Carol and Gene separated and divorced, remained very amicable throughout, and they worried about their son and how he was going to cope with that. And it was interesting because Brian loved public speaking. Most people get nervous when they start speaking in public. For Brian, it actually calmed him down. It soothed him. It energized him. He became excited. He was in 7th grade, and he talked about what his parents' divorce had meant to him and how he had coped because of the love of both sets of family, how much they loved and cared for him. He probably was a challenging student, and you could ask some of the teachers who are present today, because when Brian was a student, there wasn't a gifted and talented program per se, but he certainly was gifted and talented. And so his teachers, thank God he was in the Lee Summit School District, his teachers were very intentional about challenging and channeling the incredible intellect. In fact, at least in one of the classes, his teacher separated he and another boy in a different part of the class, you can surmise why, and would divide their time between teaching the class and then challenging and inspiring Brian and David. What really was distinctive wasn't just the incredible intellect, but the amazing heart. Because remember, as Brian himself described it, his family's inculcated in him early on an incredibly loving spirit that was distinctive, that was extraordinary. Because he had been bullied, and because he had suffered, because he was different in significant ways. Irksome and impish, I think, was the term that Ted used. I thought that was perfect. He had a heart for people who were on the periphery and a gift for drawing them into the center of his love and of life. It was so interesting. Carol started dating Max, and she told Brian was a little boy, told Brian about Max and said his name was Max Clark. And Brian's response was, "Oh, marry him. Then I don't have to change my name." And the three of them went to worlds of fun. And Max did something and won some little toy. And you got to look at the pictures in the narthex, because Max he looked like Glenn Campbell at the time, really, with the beard. And you laugh, but check that out. Test that. And he gives Brian this little stuffed animal. I don't even know what it was. And Brian looks at him so sincerely and so tenderly and says, "Max, I love you." And that's how he was. At school, he looked out for the kids who were on the outside and drew them to the inside. One boy's mother shows up for school to have lunch with him, and the little boy doesn't want to have lunch with his mother. So Brian goes up to the woman and says, "Mrs. Childress, I'll have lunch with you." I mean, that's the spirit we're talking about. He made it, of course, through high school. He tried soccer, but, he had so many allergies. He'd stand in the field and sneeze, and it was miserable. So they started him on music, and he found a mechanism, a medium to express himself, and he did so magnificently, joyously, contagiously. He graduated National Honor Society and a finalist for Merit Scholar. And he went off to college, and it's in college where he really thrived. Because all of a sudden he was in an environment where everyone was as strange as he was. And he reveled in it, and he loved it, and he found expression. He was involved in theater and speech when he was in high school, and he thought about being a performer, but then he worked actually at Worlds of Fun in the Tivoli Theater and did 5 productions a day for 6 days a week, and he decided that really wasn't a life. And so he went to college and loved it. In his junior year, he was part of the Mystical Seven, which is, I guess, akin to Phi Beta Kappa. It was the highest honor society of the school. And it's recognized not just in terms of academic prowess, but also in terms of community service, a heart for the community. He loved college. He loved student politics. He loved being involved. The book exchange that he started, so many aspects. And then he was done. They didn't think he was quite done, but Brian was done. He was actually 12 credits short of graduation, and that's when he figured that he was finished with it. He went off to Florida, and he went to a school for audio engineering, and it was really painful for the professors because they'd be teaching and they'd say there's really only one way to do this, and Brian would raise his hand and say, actually there are 3 different ways to do that. Let me show you. And so they struck a bargain with him. He wouldn't show up and annoy them, and they'd let him graduate or at least finish the course study. And it was down in Florida, as Michael described, Brian's career really launched as a serial entrepreneur. And it wasn't just IndieWire. It wasn't just GDM. It was everything. He really, in some ways, defined the whole concept of branding oneself, branding a company, branding a message. In fact, he used to say, it's the brand, darn it, only he would never say darn it. And he was emphatic about it. And he was inspiring. And he touched so many. He was really in on web design when the internet was in its infancy. Most people would have made millions. But you got to understand, Brian didn't invest in things. He invested in people. Brian did not collect material objects. He collected relationships. And he was always the one looking for those on the periphery with a barely sketched idea that he could mentor and shepherd, challenge and encourage and cajole, so that idea could really take root and blossom into something magnificent. And his business partner, Tammy, they've been partners for 20 years. She was the detail one. She made sure all the stuff was done, which really set Brian free to be the creative one. I mean, the art of the heist, I think Michael talked about. Do you remember the audio ad where the car was stolen? That was Brian. Remember the Ford ad where they had the people on the assembly line talking in the camera about what they were building? That was Brian. He actually sat down and interviewed one of the test drivers for one of the car companies, and the guy just it was like trying to pry words out of his mouth, wouldn't say anything. So Brian said, well, let's get in the car, let's go for a ride. And the guy was driving, and he couldn't stop him talking. And Brian used that as inspiration and communication. He helped companies define themselves in such a way that their brand would be recognized and appreciated by their target audience, and he did so brilliantly. For the love of life, for the love of people, for the privilege of sharing in both. Brian got sick a little over 2 months ago. And he doctored and they didn't know, and it was this vague malaise, and they weren't certain. And his condition spiraled. And he was admitted to the hospital. He was unconscious. And that's when they did the real testing. And that's when they discovered how the cancer had spread literally to every essential organ. And that's when the conversation was no longer about treatment options, but about palliative care. And that's when, I think, in some ways, Brian's true heart was revealed because of the way he compassionately cared for all the friends who came to care for him. The way he was still connecting people as he always did, whether it was in the hospital waiting room or in his room, whether it was the sense of appreciation that he shared with his family, whom he loves and adores, and his friends, whom he felt so blessed to share life with. It was funny. He was unconscious, and they admitted him as a Catholic. And his mother pointed that out to him. He got this wistful look, and he paused and he said, they would do a beautiful service. Isn't that funny? He spoke to his mother every day those last 2 months, 2+ months. And his mother and Jean were there, and Max and family. They were there with him. And his mom would ask him if it was good in his heart, if he was at peace. He gave his heart to Christ when he was a student here in the youth program, where he reached out to the kids who were a little strange or odd or awkward and drew them in and put them in the center of attention, the center of affirmation and love. And that faith never wavered. At times he felt like he may have drifted, but God never departed from him. God always was there for him. And Brian knew it, and he trusted in it. And the confidence I have, and pray that you have, is that when Brian breathed his last, surrounded by the very people he loves so much, when he breathed his last here on earth, he breathed his first in heaven. And he slipped from the embrace of the family who loves him into the God who created him, his embrace. And new life dawned. Frankly, I couldn't do this if I did not believe in heaven with all my heart, because it would be too miserable, too bleak, too despairing simply to stand and remember what was. But what gives us encouragement in the grief, comfort in the sorrow, is the assurance that one day we will be reunited with Brian. And what a day of rejoicing and celebration it will be. He's been restored to those he loved that he entrusted to God, and it breaks our hearts to lose him. But what gives us comfort is to entrust him to God. And we've already speculated what he's laughing about, but I suspect he is laughing. In fact, we started with the Hallmark card. Do you remember? If there was a Brian Clark Hallmark card, it would be one of those with a sound chip. Seriously. And this is what you would hear.
I love it.
That's a ringtone his friends put together. More than that, it's a reminder of the life we have to look to. For we have celebrated an extraordinary, exquisite life that was lived with love and passion that inspired and touched so many. If we measure wealth in terms of relationship, Brian was one of the richest men I've ever known. And that is what matters most in heaven. And one day, we will be restored, and we will hear again the laughter and experience the love. Will you pray with me, please?